Billionaire's baby was born blind until the maid gave him her daughter's eyes. What would you do if the only way your blind son could see was through another mother's final gift? You'd give me your child's eyes. His voice broke as the storm raged outside the Reed mansion. Across from him, Grace Turner stood trembling but calm. A mother who had just lost everything. She looked at him and said softly, "I'm not giving you her eyes. I'm giving her dream." In that moment, two worlds collided, wealth and grief, power and love. A man who couldn't save his family, and a woman who chose to save his son instead. What would you have done in her place? When love demanded the ultimate sacrifice. Welcome to Emotional Echoes, a channel where emotions come alive and every story leaves a lasting echo in your heart. Please subscribe to Emotional Echoes. Help us reach 1,000 subscribers so more souls can feel these stories. Stay with my video till the very end and let me know where you're watching from so I can see how far this story spreads. Now, let me tell you the story of the gift of light. It happened on a day that began with laughter. Ethan Reed had promised his wife, Laura, a quiet escape from work, just a short flight along the coast before their baby came. She was 7 months pregnant, glowing, teasing him for finally keeping a promise. He smiled, brushed a strand of hair from her face, and told her she was his reason to breathe. For a moment, the world was simple blue sky, soft wind, the sound of her voice. Then everything changed. The sky darkened faster than anyone expected. Ethan felt the aircraft shudder, the pilot shouting something he couldn't hear. Laura gripped his hand. Her eyes searched for his, calm but knowing. When the alarms began to scream, she leaned closer, her voice barely a whisper against the chaos. "Promise me, you'll protect our son." Ethan nodded. That was the last time she smiled. He remembered the sound of impact, not as an explosion, but as silence. A silence so deep it swallowed breath and thought. When he woke, he was on a hospital floor, soaked in rain and blood that wasn't his. Voices blurred, lights flickered. A doctor's face appeared above him, lips moving slowly until one sentence broke through. "We saved the baby, but your wife didn't make it." Ethan's body didn't move. Only his eyes did toward the glass, where a tiny shape lay, fighting for life. The nurse said the child couldn't see, that the nerves had been damaged. Words like optic and irreversible meant nothing to him. All he saw was a fragile chest, rising and falling, proof that life could survive even when everything else had died. He pressed his hand to the glass, whispering to the newborn who would never see his mother's face, "I'm sorry, you'll never see her, but you'll carry her light." The rain outside tapped against the window like a heartbeat that refused to stop. Ethan closed his eyes and wished it would, because that night, he didn't just lose Laura, he lost the man she had made him become. 6 years had passed. But for Ethan Reed, time had stopped the night he lost Laura. The world had moved on. But he hadn't. Every morning felt the same. The house was still silent, the curtains still closed, and his heart still carried the weight of a promise he had failed to keep. The mansion that once echoed with laughter now only held the quiet sound of footsteps and the faint tapping of a child's cane. Noah was 6 now. He had his mother's gentle smile and his father's calm voice. But his eyes, those closed, searching eyes, were a reminder of everything Ethan couldn't fix. The boy never complained. He learned to move around by touch, memorizing every wall, every corner. Sometimes, Ethan would stand at the doorway, watching his son trail his fingers along the furniture, whispering what he imagined things to be. A lamp was a tree, A rug was grass. The air was the sky. Ethan would want to correct him. But the words never came out. He was afraid of breaking the illusion his son used to survive. At night, when Noah couldn't sleep, he would crawl into his father's room and sit at the edge of the bed. He'd ask questions Ethan never knew how to answer. "What does blue look like?" Ethan would pause, searching for words. "It's like calm, like when you're safe." Noah would smile and ask again. "What about the sky?" Ethan's throat would tighten. "It's where your mum used to look when she was happy." Every answer felt like a wound he reopened by speaking. The staff had long since learned not to talk about Laura. Even the housekeepers moved quietly, as if afraid to disturb the ghosts that lingered there. Ethan spent his days buried in work, designing things that made life easier for others while ignoring the life in front of him. He told himself he was doing it for Noah. But deep down, he knew he was running from the guilt. Every time he looked at his son, he saw the price of his own choices. Sometimes, when he worked late, Noah would sit by his desk, listening to the faint hum of his father's computer. "Dad, why don't we open the curtains?" Ethan would freeze. "Because it's too bright." But Noah would tilt his head, confused. "I thought light was a good thing." Ethan wanted to agree, but he couldn't. To him, light had taken everything. So he kept the house dark, convinced that if his son couldn't see, the world shouldn't either. But even in darkness, Noah had his own way of seeing. He'd smile at the warmth of sunlight on his skin when the housekeeper accidentally left a window open. He'd laugh when rain hit the glass and say it sounded like music. Ethan would watch from the shadows, torn between grief and wonder. For 6 years, he had been surrounded by silence. Yet somehow, this little boy had found beauty inside it. Still, every night, when the house fell quiet again, Ethan would sit alone in Laura's old chair, tracing the edges of her wedding ring that he kept on a chain around his neck. He'd whisper to her like she could still hear him. "He kept my promise. Laura, he's safe." But deep down, he knew safety wasn't the same as living. And maybe that was the cruelest truth of all, that his son, blind from birth, was the only one left who could still see the light. It began with a phone call Grace Turner had been dreading. The hospital line. She froze before answering, already knowing what the voice on the other end would say. Her daughter's treatment needed another round of medication, something experimental, something she couldn't afford. Grace looked at the crumpled bills spread across her kitchen table, each one stamped past due, and felt her throat tighten. The kettle whistled behind her. But she didn't move. She just whispered, more to herself than anyone, "We'll find a way. Lily, I promise." Her phone buzzed again. This time, with a message from an agency domestic staff, wanted full-time, live-in, high salary. She read it twice. The address was unfamiliar. The name, even more so, Ethan Reed. She hesitated for a long moment, then pressed call. Her voice was steady, but her hands trembled as she said she could start tomorrow. The next morning, she arrived at the mansion before sunrise. Her reflection in the glass door looked older than she remembered. She smoothed her uniform, hid the hospital wristband, still faint on her arm, and rang the bell. When the door opened, a housekeeper led her inside without a smile. The silence in that house was heavy, almost sacred, the kind that belonged to people who'd stopped hoping. Ethan didn't look up when she was introduced. He just signed a paper and said quietly, "Keep the house clean. Don't talk to my son unless necessary." Grace nodded. She had seen that kind of distance before, the look of a man who had lost something too precious to name. She didn't ask questions. She just picked up the cleaning cloth and began to work. Later that night, when the house finally slept, Grace sat in the small staff room and called the hospital. Her daughter's voice was weak but still full of light. "Mommy, are you working for someone rich now?" Grace smiled through the ache. "Yes, sweetheart. Someone very rich." Lily giggled softly. "Maybe he can buy you a sky." Grace bit her lip to keep from crying. Maybe he already has one. When the call ended, Grace stared at the ceiling, letting the quiet of the mansion settle around her. She didn't pray for miracles anymore. She just wanted enough time to earn. Time to hold her daughter again. Time for one more morning, with sunlight on her face. And so, with eyes tired but steady, she whispered the same promise she made every night. Just a little longer. Lily, just a little longer. After that small moment of laughter, something began to shift inside the Reed mansion. It was almost invisible at first, like air moving in a closed room after years of stillness. Grace started to open the curtains a little each morning, just a few inches, enough for light to touch the floor before she closed them again. No one noticed, except Noah. He would lift his head and smile, as if he could feel sunlight even through closed eyes. Ethan noticed too, though he pretended not to. He would walk into the room and see the faint glow on the carpet, the dust floating in that light like tiny ghosts. It made his chest tighten. He'd pull the curtain shut again, trying to put everything back in its place, back in the dark where it felt safe. He told himself Grace was just overstepping, but a small part of him knew that it wasn't the light he feared. It was what it reminded him of. Laura's laughter, the life they'd lost. One afternoon, Grace found Noah standing by the window, his hands reaching toward the glass. She opened it slightly, letting the wind touch his face. He gasped and said it smelled like rain. She told him to stretch his hands outside, to feel the world instead of imagining it. When Ethan walked in, he froze. The window was open. The air was alive, and his son was laughing. For a second, Ethan didn't recognize that sound. It had been gone for too long. He snapped, his voice sharper than he meant. "You're not his therapist. You don't get to decide what he needs." Grace turned, calm but steady. Maybe he doesn't need a therapist. Maybe he just needs someone to show him the light. Ethan had no answer. The words hit harder than any accusation. He looked at his son, the joy on his face, the way he turned his head toward the wind like he was chasing something he couldn't see. Ethan wanted to yell again, but instead, he walked away. Not because he was angry, but because he was afraid she was right. That night, Ethan couldn't sleep. He kept hearing Noah's laughter echoing down the hallway. It wasn't loud, but it filled the house in a way that silence never could. He sat in his office, the same spot where he'd spent years hiding behind work, and realized how foreign that sound had become. Laughter. It felt like betrayal to let it live here again. Yet he couldn't stop listening. The walls that had absorbed years of grief now carried something lighter, something that sounded dangerously close to hope. Before going to bed, Ethan walked past Noah's room. Through the crack in the door, he saw Grace sitting beside the boy's bed, telling him stories about clouds and the ocean. Noah asked her if the ocean was loud. Grace laughed and said it was, but only when you were close enough to listen. Ethan leaned against the wall, unseen, and for the first time in 6 years, he let himself smile. It was small, hesitant, but real. For a while, it almost felt like the house had learned to breathe again. Noah's laughter filled corners that had been silent for years. Even Ethan had started to speak softer, as if afraid to break the fragile peace Grace had built. But peace never lasts long for people who have already lost too much. It happened one evening when Grace was reading to Noah. His head rested on her arm as she told him about clouds and how they never stay in one place. The phone on the table started ringing. She almost ignored it, not wanting to interrupt the moment, but something inside her knew. She picked it up, and the world shifted. The nurse's voice trembled through the line. "Mrs. Turner, it's your daughter. You should come now." The book slid from her hand. Noah sensed the change in her breathing. He asked if she was okay, and Grace forced a smile he couldn't see. She said she just needed to go check something and promised to finish the story later. But when she left the room, her legs barely held her up. Her heart was already running faster than her body could follow. By the time she reached the hospital, night had fallen. The smell of disinfectant and rain filled the air. Grace hurried down the hallway, her shoes squeaking against the floor. Every beep, every sigh of the machines sounded like a countdown. When she opened the door, Lily was awake, small and pale, her eyes glassy but gentle. She smiled the way only a child could in pain. Grace took her hand, whispering that she was here. Lily's voice was thin but steady. "Mommy, did you see the sky today?" Grace said no. She hadn't looked at it in a long time. Lily closed her eyes for a moment. "Then maybe you should, because I dreamed about it. It was blue, like music." Grace felt her throat close. She tried to speak, but Lily continued. "If I have to go, promise me someone will see it for me." Grace froze. She wanted to tell her not to talk like that, to hold on, that everything would be fine. But she couldn't lie to her. Instead, she pressed her forehead to her daughter's hand and whispered, "You'll see it again someday, my love." Lily smiled weakly. "Maybe I'll see it through someone else." The monitors kept beeping. The sound grew slower, then steadied again. Grace stayed there for hours, afraid to close her eyes, afraid that if she blinked too long, the world would take her child away. She whispered songs Lily loved, tracing circles on her palm, memorizing every breath. When the nurse came to check in, she nodded and said they were fine. But deep inside, she already knew time was slipping. The next morning, Grace went back to the mansion. Her face was calm, but her eyes were empty. She didn't tell Ethan what had happened. She couldn't. She just went back to work, cleaned the same rooms, folded the same blankets, pretending the world hadn't changed. That night, Noah asked why she sounded sad. She said she was just tired. Then Noah asked a question she wasn't ready for. "What does the sky feel like?" Grace took a deep breath. She told him it felt like something too big to hold, something that touches you even when you can't see it. He smiled and said he hoped to feel it one day. Grace nodded. But inside, something broke. She realized Lily's words weren't just goodbye. They were a wish. Later, when Ethan passed by Noah's room, he saw the boy laughing again as Grace described clouds turning gold at sunset. He didn't know that behind that soft smile, Grace's heart was falling apart. She kept her voice steady, her hands gentle, her pain hidden. But that night, after Noah fell asleep, she stepped outside, looked up at the sky for the first time in years, and whispered the promise she had made. "If you can't see it, Lily, I'll make sure someone else will. After that night at the hospital, something inside Grace began to change. She moved through each day quietly. But her heart carried two worlds, the one she was losing and the one she was trying to keep alive. Between those worlds were two children who had never met, but somehow seemed to know each other. Every evening, when she called the hospital, she told Lily stories about a boy named Noah, the boy who couldn't see but smiled anyway. Lily listened with fascination. She would ask what his voice sounded like, what games he liked. If he was scared of the dark, Grace described how Noah touched walls to find his way and laughed when the rain touched his face. Lily smiled softly and said she wanted to paint him. The next morning, a nurse sent Grace a photo of the drawing. It showed a small boy sitting under a window, head tilted toward the light. Across the top, in shaky letters, Lily had written, "A boy who can't see but still smiles." Grace saved the picture on her phone, staring at it long after the screen dimmed. At the mansion, Grace noticed Noah changing too. He asked more questions now, about sounds, colors, and things he couldn't see. One day he asked, "Do you think light has a sound?" Grace told him, "Maybe it does, but only for those who really listen." When she said that, he turned toward her voice and smiled. It was the same smile Lily used to have, quiet and brave, the kind that came from somewhere deeper than joy. Ethan watched all of this from a distance. He'd begun coming home earlier, pretending it was for work, but really it was to hear Noah laugh. At first, he stood in the doorway, just listening. Grace would sit beside the boy, her voice calm, her patience endless. There was something about the way she spoke, the way Noah's face softened when she did. It reminded Ethan of the warmth that used to live in this house before the storm took it all away. One evening, Grace invited Ethan to sit with them for dinner. It was the first time in years anyone had asked. He hesitated, but Noah's small hand reached out toward the sound of his father's footsteps. "Sit with us, Dad." The words hit Ethan harder than he expected. He sat down. For the first time in 6 years, the dining table was not silent. Grace told stories about her daughter's favorite songs, and Noah giggled when Ethan tried to hum along. Something fragile but real began to form between them. Later that night, as Grace washed the dishes, she heard Noah tell Ethan that he wanted to see the sky one day. Ethan looked at Grace, his eyes heavy with the weight of years. He said softly that maybe some things are meant to be felt, not seen. But Grace shook her head gently. Sometimes feeling isn't enough. Sometimes you have to believe there's more. Ethan didn't answer, but his gaze lingered on her longer than before. In the weeks that followed, the house changed again. The curtains stayed open longer. Music played softly in the background. Ethan found himself joining their routines without realizing it. He read short stories at night, while Grace helped Noah draw with his fingers on textured paper. Each laugh, each word, each shared silence felt like stitching two broken souls back together. Grace often looked at Noah and thought of Lily. Two children, both fragile, both fighting their own kind of darkness, and somehow, through love and loss, they were healing each other. She didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but for the first time in a long time, she felt something close to peace. It was raining again, but Grace barely noticed. She drove through the empty streets, one hand gripping the wheel, the other holding onto a prayer she couldn't say out loud. The hospital lights came into view, too bright, too white. Her legs shook when she stepped out of the car. She already knew. Mothers always know. The doctor met her at the door, his face calm but heavy. He didn't need to speak. Grace walked past him, down the familiar hallway, into the small room that had been her world for months. Lily was lying there, pale and still, her chest rising just enough to keep hope alive. Grace sat beside the bed and took her daughter's hand. Still warm, still soft. Lily opened her eyes slowly. They were tired, but full of peace. She smiled when she saw her mother. "Hey, Mommy," she whispered, like she was waking from a nap. Grace stroked her hair. "I'm here, sweetheart." Lily took a shallow breath. "Did you see the sky today?" Grace shook her head. "No, I didn't look." Lily's lips curved into a faint smile. "You should. It's beautiful. I dreamed about it." Grace's voice broke. "Tell me about your dream." Lily looked past her, like she was already halfway there. "It was blue, Mommy, like music. And if I have to go, maybe someone else can see it for me." Grace's heart clenched so hard, she thought it might stop. She wanted to say no, to fight, to tell her to stay. But all that came out was a whisper. "You'll see it again, my love. I promise." Lily nodded slightly. "Maybe I'll see it through someone else's eyes." Then her fingers loosened in Grace's hand. Her breathing slowed, then faded soft, almost gentle. Grace held on anyway. She didn't cry at first. She just sat there, rocking slightly, whispering her daughter's name like it could pull her back. After a while, Anursa came in, eyes red, voice low. "Take your time." Grace nodded but didn't move. She looked at Lily's small face, so calm, so light, and finally let the tears fall. She reached for the drawing. Lily had made the boy who can't see but still smiles and placed it on her daughter's chest. Her voice trembled as she spoke. "You kept your promise, sweetheart. Now I know who will see for you." The rain tapped softly against the window, but Grace didn't look. She just sat there, holding her child's hand, whispering thank you over and over. It wasn't loud grief. It was quiet, deep, the kind that stays forever. Somewhere inside that silence, love was still breathing. The day after the funeral, Grace moved like a shadow through her own life. The world around her was too bright, too loud, as if mocking the silence she carried inside. She had buried her only child, yet something inside her refused to stop breathing. Lily's words still echoed in her head. "Let someone else see it for me." When Grace walked back into the Reed mansion, Ethan was in the study, hunched over the desk, pretending to read. He looked up, startled by her presence. Her face was pale, her eyes red but steady. She held a small envelope in her hand, the hospital seal still unbroken. For a long moment, neither spoke. The room was so still that even the ticking clock sounded cruel. Finally, she took a breath and said she wanted to talk about something important. Ethan nodded, unsure what to expect. Grace placed the envelope on the desk between them and pushed it gently forward. "It's from the hospital," she said quietly. "About my daughter." Ethan froze, his throat tightening. He remembered the soft way Grace used to talk about Lily, how her eyes always lit up when she mentioned her name. Now those eyes were hollow. She continued, her voice trembling but clear. Lily was an organ donor. It was her wish. Ethan blinked, confused, unable to find the words. Grace looked at him then, straight into his eyes. They said her corneas were healthy. She wanted someone else to see the sky for her. Ethan's lips parted, but no sound came out. The words felt unreal, too heavy to hold. Grace's voice softened even more. I want Noah to have her eyes. He stared at her in disbelief, shaking his head slowly. You would give me your child's eyes, his voice cracked, breaking into a whisper. Grace swallowed hard. I'm not giving you her eyes. I'm giving her dream. That sentence shattered the air between them. Ethan covered his face with his hands, his shoulders trembling. For years, he had lived behind walls of guilt, hiding from the pain of loss. And now, standing before him was a mother who had just lost her daughter, offering the one thing that had always been denied to him, light. Grace stepped closer, her voice keyed but strong. She told him how Lily used to draw pictures of Noah, the boy she had never met, the boy who smiled at the sky he couldn't see, how she had said someone else should see it for her. Grace's hands trembled as she spoke, but her eyes didn't flinch. She wasn't asking for pity. She was giving meaning to the unbearable. Ethan stood there, tears running freely now. He whispered that he didn't deserve this kind of grace, that no one could. Grace shook her head. It's not about deserving. It's about love, finding a way to live on. He reached across the desk, his hand covering hers. Neither spoke again. They didn't need to. Between them was the weight of two parents who had lost everything and somehow found each other at the edge of that loss. In that silence, something shifted, something small but real, like the first light breaking through a long night. The following week passed in silence, but it wasn't the same silence that had once haunted the Reed mansion. This one was full of waiting, full of fragile hope. Ethan stayed close to the hospital, and Grace never left the small chapel across the hall from the operating room. It felt like the whole world was holding its breath for one child's chance to see. Inside the operating room, everything was white. The light above the table was sharp, clean, almost holy. The doctors moved carefully, their voices quiet and calm. Somewhere beyond the glass, Noah lay still under the bright lamps, his small chest rising and falling slowly. His life had been defined by darkness, but now, for the first time, someone was giving him a doorway into light. Outside, Grace sat alone, a photo of Lily pressed against her chest. She whispered softly, as if her daughter could hear her through the walls. You're helping him now. Sweetheart, you said someone would see the sky for you. Maybe this is the moment. Her hands trembled as she traced Lily's face in the picture. She wasn't praying for success. She was simply talking to her child, the way mothers do when words have run out. Ethan walked toward her, but stopped when he saw her eyes closed, her lips moving quietly. He stood there in silence, realizing that this woman had done something no one else could. She had turned her grief into light for his son. For the first time in years, Ethan prayed, not for himself, but for her, for Lily, for the small boy behind that door who was about to see the world his mother died wishing for. Ours passed. Then the surgeon appeared, removing his mask. His expression softened into something gentle. The surgery was a success. Grace covered her mouth, her eyes filling with tears. Ethan exhaled the breath he didn't know he had been holding. For the first time, hope didn't hurt. It felt alive. A week later, Noah sat on a hospital bed, his eyes covered with white bandages. Grace stood by the window, holding the curtains slightly open, letting a thin beam of daylight spill across the floor. Ethan sat beside his son, his hand gripping Noah's fingers tightly. The doctor told Noah to stay still as the bandages were removed. The room was so quiet they could hear each other breathe. The final layer came off. Noah blinked, his eyes wet, unsure of the shapes forming before him. His lips parted in awe. Light, he whispered, and something blue. Ethan's throat tightened. That's the sky. Son, that's what your mother loved most. Noah turned his head slowly toward Grace. His voice was trembling but full of wonder. It's beautiful. Grace pressed her hand to her heart, tears sliding down her cheeks. In that moment, she didn't see pain. She saw her daughter's spirit reflected in those eyes, shining quietly back at her. The boy reached out toward the window, fingers outstretched toward the light. Ethan placed his hand over Grace's shoulder. Neither spoke. They didn't need to. The world had already said everything through the simple miracle before them. A mother's love had crossed the line between death and life to give a child his first sunrise. Months passed, and for the first time in years, the Reed mansion no longer felt like a tomb. The windows stayed open. Sunlight poured in, and laughter replaced the echo of silence. Grace still came by sometimes, not as an employee, but as family. Noah would wait for her by the garden gate, always asking if she thought Lily could see him from the sky, and Grace would smile, saying she was sure of it. Ethan kept his promise. He turned the pain that had nearly destroyed him into purpose. With Grace's help, he created the Lily's Sky Foundation, a charity that provided free eye surgeries for children who couldn't afford them. Every detail of the office was designed with meaning. On one wall hung two paintings. The first was Lily's A Boy Who Can't See But Still Smiles. The second was drawn by Noah a year later, A Girl Who Gave Me the Sky. Together, they faced the window overlooking the city, as if watching over everyone who entered. Sometimes, Ethan would stand there in silence, staring at those paintings. He had everything money could buy, but it was only through loss that he learned what truly mattered. Grace often joined him, and though neither spoke of the past, it was always there, soft, forgiving, like a shadow that had learned to rest. Noah grew stronger, braver. Every morning, he would open the curtains himself, letting the light flood his room. He'd talk about colors like they were old friends he'd finally met. One day, he asked Ethan what blue really meant. Ethan smiled and said it was the color of hope. Noah nodded and said he thought Lily would like that answer. On the first anniversary of his surgery, they held a small gathering at the foundation. Children ran around with patches over their healing eyes, their laughter filling the halls. Grace stood among them, her heart full, her grief softer now. Ethan gave a short speech, his voice steady. He said that some gifts come wrapped in sorrow, but when opened, they fill the world with light. Later that evening, as the sun began to set, Noah stood by the window of his father's office. The Seattle sky stretched wide and endless, brushed with orange and gold. He whispered softly, almost to himself, "Thank you, Lily. I can see it now." Ethan placed a hand on his son's shoulder, and together they watched the light fade into twilight. Grace stood a few steps behind, her eyes glistening. It was not a sad silence anymore. It was full of peace. Some lights fade too soon, but the love behind them never dies. It just finds new eyes to shine through. And for those who choose to love, even after loss, the world will always be bright again. If this story touched you, Share your thoughts in the comments and let someone else feel its light. Subscribe, like, and share emotional echoes so more hearts can be healed through stories like this. Thanks for listening.